Hi, so today I'm going to be presenting on Mary Church Terrell. So some quick background information about her. She was born on September 23rd in 1863 in Memphis, Tennessee. She would die on July 24th, 1954 at 90 years old. She was a daughter of former slaves. However, it's important to note that although she was probably raised with slave stories and just learning about slavery and racial injustice, her mother was an owner of a hair salon, and her father was a business owner in real estate, and he would become the first Black millionaire in the South. So that's important to note because she did have wealth in her family. Now, she wasn't necessarily raised as quote unquote being rich because when her family accumulated wealth is not as known. Um, but she definitely had more privilege than what we're typically used to when talking about the this time period with African Americans. So yeah, so there was money in the family, and this is proven because she would go on to attend school in Ohio, and she graduated from Oberlin College with a bachelor's of arts in classical language. So obviously, coming from Tennessee to Ohio, she had to have a decent amount of money. Um, and then she would help found and support many different social organizations and education movements and activist groups. As well, she would be an author, a teacher, board member, and activist. Okay, so while attending school in Ohio, Mary Churchill decided to pursue an education at Auburn College. So Auburn College was one of the first colleges to accept Black students, and as well one of the first colleges to accept women. So in 1835, the college started accepting Black men, and then in 1837 they started accepting all women. So by 1900, one-third of all Black professionals had an undergraduate degree from Auburn College. Um, Yeah, so she also started schooling at 8 years old while in Ohio. She attended um, high school through like the urban college like system, and then the urban college was obviously for higher education. So after graduation, Mary Terrell pursued her dreams of becoming a teacher. So she moved to Washington, D.C., and began teaching at M Street Colored High School in 1887. And then she would resign in 1891 due to marriage. And then in 1895, she did become the superintendent of the school. So she had to resign from being a teacher because, according to Washington, D.C. law, married women were not allowed to be teachers. So she met her husband, Robert Herberton Terrell, at the school. He worked there as well, and so she would have to resign. Um, and she was married then in 1891. So her social activism career then would begin, and I'm breaking it down to focus primarily on education right now. So in 1892, her friend Thomas Moss was lynched back in her hometown of Memphis. This led to the creation of the Colored Women's League. So the Colored Women's League was a service club that they primarily focused on unity and social progress, helping the African American community. Um, so she wanted to focus on women's rights outside of just the church. Because that's typically like all they really had. They were just kind of like focused on religion, and she wanted to expand upon that. And then the league would unite with the Federation of Afro-American Women to include a larger audience. This would become the National Association of Colored Women. Their motto was "Lifting as we climb." This association created nurseries and kindergartens for Black children. So then she would be elected as president, and she served from 1896 to 1901 for the association. And then she was involved in the Washington's Board of Education from 1895 to 1901, and then again in 1906 to 1911. And then she was involved as well with women in politics and social activism. So she was involved with the National American Women's Suffrage Association. It's important to note that the association had white chapters only, meaning that technically only white women were allowed within it. However, Mary Churchill was African American, and she would be a speaker for the group, and she would focus a lot on the African American community and issues such as lynching, racial issues, and education. Um, and then she would present a speech in Germany to the International Council of Women, and she gave this speech completely in German. and it was focusing on Black women's rights. So she was also fluent in French, German, and Italian, because she traveled in Europe during her early teaching years and while still in school getting an education. Again, also signs of her wealth of being able to travel. Um, so as well, then in 1898, with the NAWSA, she gave a speech in D.C., The Progress of Colored Women, again, focusing on Black women's rights, expanding outside of the church, and focusing on civil rights, the community as a whole, education, um, different ways of uplifting. She then became involved with the Republican Party. So she was president of the Women's Republican League. So the league helped women vote, and helped give them voter information, educate the voters. It was just a way of getting women involved. And she was involved with the Warren G. Harding's campaign in 1920. So the 19th Amendment would be ratified in 1920, helping women um, be able to vote. And then she helped establish the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So the NAACP was a civil rights group. Again, just another different organization focusing on African Americans. And then she became a published author in 1940, A Colored Woman in a White World. She had many different poems and journals and articles, but this specific piece is an account of her own personal life. So she would talk about racism and sexism, her experiences at school, becoming a teacher, living in Washington, D.C. She had meetings with Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony. So just her life, um, experiencing racism and sexism, but as well just like her development, um, her civil rights movements, her involvement in the different organizations and groups and associations she would become involved in, and just kind of like a story. It's a story of her life, and then it obviously helped to push social and political change because it's giving us a viewpoint that we don't typically um, see most of the time because it's focusing on a colored woman, um, who's also in like pretty important roles of the social change because she was obviously members of these groups, but she also helped found them. She also helped spread the message. She was more than just she's a named person who we have to be able to look to that actually pushed for change. And then, so her later years, so she helped desegregate eating areas in Washington, D.C. And then in 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education ruling declared that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Um, it kind of brings her entire life into full circle because her career started with education and focusing on um, African American rights with education, and then would see the racial segregation be ruled as unconstitutional in public schools. So it kind of brings a full circle for her life, the beginning and the end. Um, she also helped. She also helped integrate movements and events of protest. So she a lot of the times would emphasize on the need for African American women to be involved in the women's movements, as well as women being involved in the African American movements. So she was able to like bridge those gaps between the respective communities and advocate for like the larger total because she realized the strength in numbers and like the hypocrisy of not including people of your own group that you're trying to claim rights for. So she was very important in that aspect because she was advocating for all. It was never just about what directly fit her or like it did obviously directly fit her as a African American woman, but in these circumstances, like it didn't directly fit just being African American and then excluding women, or just focusing on African American men, but like only like religiously. Like it was like the broader context of it. Um, yeah, so it's important to note her that she created change and that she would use her privilege that she had of wealth and of money to be able to create change. And she was using her education for the greater good. She didn't just use it to like showcase that she was smart. She actually then took that outside into the world and helped create change. And this is just showcase the history of the United States because she helped shape these events and she bridges the gap between slavery and then the civil rights movement because her parents were slaves and then she's active all the way into the civil rights movement. So I think it just helps with the timeline of like how recent some of these events are and how they do need to be talked about. They do need to be recognized, and it's like still fresh memory. It's fresh history in the United States still. Um, she helps break the narrative that whites and men were the creations of all the change. That without them, the African Americans wouldn't have got the change that they deserved. That they actually were actively involved in their own achievement of rights. Um, And then she was also a black woman in power at this time when this was definitely not a thing that is typically talked about. Um, she had power in these obviously these organizations involved in different boards and memberships, and then she was also always just breaking the barriers because her face was like in places that it wasn't supposed to be, like for the different associations she was in and being giving the presentations, being on stage like her voice being directly heard. And as well, she's also international, which I think is something that's important to note that it's not just American history. Like this is a bigger context. It applies to more than just the United States, women's rights and African Americans' rights. And then I just have a list of the sources that I used of where I got my information based on her. All right. Thank you.